the calling of Elisha and the succession of Elijah. The story of Elisha's calling is a pivotal moment in the history of the Hebrew prophets, marking a transition between two generations of divine messengers. Elisha's calling is recorded in 1 Kings 19:19-21, where God instructed Elijah to anoint Elisha as his successor. The divine appointment. Elijah, a prophet known for his bold confrontation with the idolatry of Israel, was weary. After the dramatic victory at Mount Carmel over the prophets of Baal, Elijah fled from Queen Jezebel's threats and found himself in a state of spiritual exhaustion. At Mount Horeb, God instructed him to anoint Elisha as the next prophet of Israel. This was not just a symbolic gesture, it was a divine appointment. Elisha was chosen to continue Elijah's work and carry on the prophetic mission, ensuring that Israel would not be left without a witness to God's truth. The call to Elisha. When Elijah found Elisha, he was plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen, which symbolized a life of hard work and responsibility. Elijah, upon encountering Elisha, threw his mantle, a symbol of prophetic authority, over him, signaling that Elisha was being chosen as his successor. This action was a clear sign of God's calling and the passing of the prophetic mantle from one prophet to the next. Elisha's immediate response was one of total commitment. Rather than hesitating or asking for more time, Elisha asked for permission to say goodbye to his family, a gesture that acknowledged the significance of the calling. He slaughtered his oxen, used the plowing equipment for a feast, and then followed Elijah. This act of devotion demonstrated that Elisha was willing to leave everything behind to fulfill God's calling. The successor's promise. As Elisha followed Elijah, he observed the profound power and authority that Elijah exercised as a prophet of God. However, Elisha was not just content with following. He sought to receive a double portion of Elijah's spirit. 2 Kings 2-9, a request symbolizing the desire to carry on the prophetic work with even greater strength. Elijah granted this request under one condition. Elisha would need to witness his departure to confirm his inheritance of the prophetic mantle. This moment culminated in Elijah's ascension to heaven in a whirlwind, with Elisha standing by his side, witnessing the dramatic event. As Elijah was taken up, Elisha took up the mantle and parted the Jordan River, symbolizing the transfer of prophetic authority. The significance of the call. Elisha's calling and succession of Elijah was not merely a passing of the baton, but a divine empowerment for Elisha to carry on the work of confronting idolatry and proclaiming God's judgment and mercy. In receiving the double portion, Elisha's prophetic ministry was marked by great power and miracles, showing that God's work in Israel continued with renewed vigor and presence. The story of Elisha's call also demonstrates the faithfulness of God in ensuring that his work continues across generations. Even in moments of fatigue and despair, God's plan moves forward, and he raises up new leaders to carry out his purposes. Elisha's unwavering commitment to Elijah's mission also serves as a model for believers today in their calling to follow God without hesitation, trusting in his leading and purpose. The miracles of Elisha. Elisha's life was marked by an extraordinary series of miracles, demonstrating God's power and his faithfulness to those who trust in him. One of the most striking aspects of Elisha's ministry was that he performed twice as many miracles as his predecessor, Elijah, fulfilling his request for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. 2 Kings 2-9. The miracle of the widow's oil. One of Elisha's first recorded miracles occurred when a widow in dire need approached him. Her husband, a prophet, had died, leaving her with a great debt that she could not pay. As a result, her sons were about to be taken into slavery to settle the debt. In a moment of compassion, Elisha instructed the widow to gather as many empty vessels as she could find. Then, he told her to pour the little oil she had into those vessels. Miraculously, the oil did not run out until every vessel was filled. The widow was able to sell the oil, pay her debt, and live in freedom with her sons. 2 Kings 4-1-7. The healing of Naaman. One of Elisha's most well-known miracles involved Naaman, a commander of the Syrian army, who suffered from leprosy. Naaman sought healing through Elisha after his wife's servant girl, an Israelite captive, recommended him. Elisha instructed Naaman to wash himself 7 times in the Jordan River, a command that seemed too simple for such a serious condition. Initially reluctant, Naaman eventually obeyed and was miraculously healed, his skin restored as though he were a young child. 2 Kings 5-1-14. This miracle not only healed Naaman, but also revealed the power of God to extend beyond Israel to even Israel's enemies, the floating axe head. In another miracle, one of Elisha's disciples lost an iron axe head while cutting wood by the Jordan River. Distressed, because the axe was borrowed, he cried out to Elisha. Elisha threw a stick into the water at the place where the axe head had fallen, and miraculously, the iron floated to the surface. The disciple was able to retrieve it, and the situation was resolved. 2 Kings 6-1-7. The power of Elisha's ministry. Elisha's miracles were not only signs of God's compassion, but also of his judgment. He cursed a group of mocking youths, and 2 bears came out of the forest to maul 42 of them. 2 Kings 2:23-25. His miracles also served to reinforce Israel's spiritual identity, reminding the people that God was active and present among them, even in their rebellion. Through these miracles, Elisha demonstrated that God's power was not limited by the natural world. His ability to heal, provide, and even raise the dead pointed to a God who was both merciful and mighty, offering hope to those in need and judgment to those who mocked his authority. Elisha's miracles proved that God's presence was still deeply involved in the lives of his people, working through Elisha to continue the legacy of the prophetic ministry and pointing to the ultimate hope of salvation through God's power. Elisha's confrontation with the kings of Israel and his prophetic vision. Elisha's role as a prophet extended beyond personal miracles. He was deeply involved in guiding the kings of Israel, offering divine wisdom and judgment during critical moments in the kingdom's history. His interactions with the kings were often marked by prophetic confrontation and clear visions of the future. The king of Israel and the Moabite War. One of the most significant prophetic moments in Elisha's ministry occurred during a time of war. The king of Israel, Jehoram, sought Elisha's guidance before battling the Moabites, who had rebelled against Israel. The armies of Israel, Judah, and Edom joined forces to fight the Moabites. However, they soon found themselves stranded in the desert without water, facing certain death by thirst. In this moment of desperation, King Jehoram turned to Elisha. Despite the king's wickedness, Elisha responded with compassion for the army's need. He called for a vision of water, and Elisha prophesied that God would provide not only water for the troops, but also a victory over the Moabites. As Elisha foretold, the next morning, water miraculously filled the valley, and the Israelite armies were able to fight and defeat the Moabites. 2 Kings 3-9-20. Elisha's prophetic rebuke to Jehoram. Elisha's relationship with King Jehoram was not always one of favor. At times, he would openly rebuke the kings for their unfaithfulness to God. When Jehoram sought Elisha's help during the siege of Samaria, Elisha responded with a harsh prophetic word. He declared that, despite the current suffering, God would soon bring an unexpected deliverance for Israel. Elisha's prophecy came to pass. The siege was lifted, and food became abundant almost overnight. 2 Kings 6:24-33. This event demonstrated Elisha's role as a prophet who spoke with boldness, calling the people and their rulers to repentance and trust in God's sovereignty. The vision of the Syrian army. Elisha's prophetic vision extended beyond military matters to reveal God's divine protection. During a time of conflict with the Syrians, the king of Aram, Syria, repeatedly tried to capture Elisha, who had been revealing the king's military plans to Israel. One night, the Syrian army surrounded the city of Dothan, where Elisha and his servant were. Filled with fear, the servant asked Elisha what they should do. Elisha, full of faith, prayed for God to open the servant's eyes. The servant then saw a vast heavenly army of horses and chariots of fire, surrounding them for protection. Elisha reassured the servant that they were not outnumbered, for God's army was far greater than the enemy's. 2 Kings 6-8-23. Elisha's role as a prophetic voice. In these moments, Elisha was more than just a miracle worker. He was a prophetic voice to the kings of Israel, calling them to rely on God's provision and leadership. His actions showed that God's vision wasn't limited to the physical realm, but included the unseen spiritual reality. Through Elisha's words, kings were confronted with the truth, sometimes with harsh rebukes, and other times with words of hope, showing that God's power could bring deliverance even in the most impossible situations. Elisha's prophetic confrontation with the kings was a powerful reminder that the king's authority was ultimately under God's rule. His vision was clear. God was always present, guiding and protecting those who placed their trust in him and confronting those who turned away from him. The death of Elisha and his final miracles. As Elisha grew older, his prophetic influence in Israel remained strong. Yet, even in his final moments, his life was marked by the miraculous power of God. Elisha's death is recorded in 2 Kings 13:14, where we learn that King Joash of Israel came to him weeping and asking for help against the Syrians. Elisha, though near death, prophesied one last victory for Israel, instructing the king to shoot an arrow, symbolizing God's future victory over Syria. However, the most remarkable miracles surrounding Elisha's death occurred after he passed away. When Elisha died, he was buried, but sometime later, a man who had died was hastily thrown into Elisha's tomb during a raid by a Moabite band. As soon as the dead man's body touched Elisha's bones, the man was revived, standing to his feet alive. 2 Kings 13:20-21. This final miracle served as a powerful reminder that even in death, Elisha's prophetic legacy continued, showing that God's power was still active through him, even beyond his earthly life.